Now I want to set up my second domain controller. But the first thing I might want to do is actually join it to the domain itself. Sometimes it's just easier if you join a server to Active Directory as a member server first, and then promote it to a domain controller if you want to. It's optional. You can just promote it without doing that step, but I seem to have less issues with that, DNS wise, because there's already a record of that object in Active Directory, so that when you promote it to a domain controller, you just seem to have fewer problems. Anyway, for our second domain controller to be, not a domain controller yet, but it will become one, I want to sign in. Okay, and again, all right, so this is T3000 DC2, right? Notice, in this case, I'm not part of SkyNet. I'm not part of Active Directory. This is just a server standing alone by itself. Has not been joined to AD yet. And if you look at my IP settings, right? See, there's no DNS suffix of Active Directory. There's no SkyNet.ai. So this T3000 stands alone by itself. And one of the things I want to do, I want to make sure that I can reach my domain controller. I'm 192.168.70.16. Well, I want to make sure I can ping 192.168.70.15. And in this instance, I get 4 echo replies, okay? So if I get 4 echo replies, I know that I can now reach that server. What I do want to do, I'm going to configure that server as a DNS server for this, right? This the standalone core server right now that's not part of Active Directory. So to do that, I'm going to do sconfig, I'm going to do network settings, go to the adapter, set the network adapter address, and once I get DHCP set up in Active Directory, it'll automatically configure my hosts with the DNS settings they need. But I don't have that set up yet. So I'm going to do this manually to set DNS servers. Now I'm 16, but remember that the domain controller that we set up, the first one, where the global catalog is, and ntds.did and sysfall, all of that is 15. So that's where I need to point the server to, 192.168.70.15. So that's my preferred DNS. And again, we're going to set up DNS forwarding later, which will take care of external queries to the internet. So I'm not going to worry about a secondary or tertiary DNS server. 4 to return to the main menu, and 15 to exit. And ipconfig once again to verify my IP settings. All right, so I'm static IP16, this core server, but I'm pointing to 15 for my DNS now. Now I'm ready to join the domain. And to do that, I just need to run PowerShell. Okay, and not PowerShell, sorry. PowerShell. And in PowerShell, I really just need to use the command add computer. And that'll add a member or a computer to the domain. And the domain name, I have to pass that in as an option. It needs to know what domain to join. In this case, SkyNet.ai. Remember? That was the name of our domain. And for credential, I'm just going to tell it to use a credential prompt, which is Get-Credential. Okay? And I'm going to turn on verbose mode, because you know how I like that verbosity. Yeah. All right, and I need to use, this needs to be an account that's in Active Directory that has permission. So my administrator account, and I didn't spell that right. My administrator account, right, in SkyNet, it actually has, it has the credentials. It has the domain admin privileges necessary to join a computer or a member server to Active Directory, to the domain. So I'm going to use that account. And here we go, has succeeded is true. But notice the changes will not take effect until we restart our T3000 DC2. Okay? So if I do that, let me look at all of my settings here. All right. So it added the DNS suffix for SkyNet.ai, right? But I still have to reboot to fully be a member of this domain. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that I've rebooted, I'm going to sign in. And if I just sign in by default, this would be the sign in to my local server. And I can do that because this is a member server and not a domain controller yet. I have a choice. I can sign in locally to the server, and that is if I do this. All right, so notice that this is the local Carly Solelli account on the T3000 DC2, all right, on that core server, if I use the who am I command, okay? But I do have all my domain settings. Right, here's my primary DNS suffix, SkyNet.ai. So I'm gonna exit. And I'll sign out, all right? And I'm gonna hit escape. And then hit escape to switch users. So now I'm going to choose other user. And if I do, see what pops up? Now I don't just have the option to sign in locally, because this is now a member server. It's a member of Active Directory. It's been added to the domain. I can now choose to sign into SkyNet. And I can use username Carly Solelli, which that was converted to an Active Directory account, right? Because when you convert a core server into a domain controller, you can no longer sign in locally. You can only sign into AD because it's a domain controller. But DC2 right now that we're on, it's not a domain controller yet. It's only a member server. So we have a choice. We can sign in locally, or we can sign into Active Directory, right? So if I do that, in this case, now I'm signed into AD, so now look where I am. carlysolelli.skynet. And if I do a who am I, it puts the domain now in front of my name. So instead of the host name of the computer, which is T-3000-DC2, it puts SkyNet, the name of my domain. It prefixes it, okay? And again, if we look at the IP information, here's my primary DNS suffix, right? There's SkyNet.ai, okay? Okay, now because I'm not, because this is not yet a domain controller, I can't really use domain admin privileges, to promote this. So I'm going to go ahead and exit. And sign out. And we're going to sign in as a local user in this instance. Okay, and so the way to do that is to Alright, so notice how the sign into switched from the domain, in this case, now to the host name. So this is local, right? And I'm going to sign in as an account with local administrative privileges. And that's administrator and my password. Okay. And now, if I do who am I, see, now notice it's the host name. So on this member server, which is not yet a domain controller, I signed in locally. But I have local administrator privileges, which I'm going to need to promote this to a domain controller. Now I need some PowerShell. So we run the command PowerShell. And like we did previously, we can call get Windows feature. But there's a lot of features there, right? A lot of roles and features. So we need to narrow it down. And we can pipe it to where that name, like, and they all start with ADDS. So we'll wildcard AD. I need to close my braces there. All right. So specifically what we need is AD-domain-services, right? Active Directory Domain Services. And we're going to install that feature. And so we're just going to say install Windows feature. There should be a dash there. Install Windows feature AD-domain-services, and then management tools. I'm just going to say include management tools. And this will give us the core components we need to be able to import the Active Directory Services Deployment module with import module, and then we can join our domain controller. Okay, so success true. We're good there. And now the next thing we want to do is import module. And then ADDS, Directory Services Deployment. Okay, and now that we've done that, so now with the preliminary steps taken care of, we can set up our core server here to be a second domain controller. Now, the first time we did this, we used install-ADDS forest, right? That's because Active Directory didn't exist. We had to set up a new forest and a new domain. That was the very first domain controller, right? We're going to use a different command here. We don't want to use ADDS forest because we don't want to create a new forest. Heck no. We want to join the second core server as a secondary domain controller to a domain and a forest that already exists. And so the command we'll use instead is install-ADDS domain controller, all right? Active Directory Domain Services domain controller. So install ADDS domain controller. And we want to pass in a few arguments here. First off, we definitely need the domain name, right? How do we know what domain we want to join? So SkyNet.ai, that's the name of the domain we want to join this to as a secondary domain controller. I'm going to choose install DNS because we want Active Directory integrated DNS. And I'm going to choose true as the option for that. And then for the permission, an account for credentials. Spell that right. Credential. For credentials, we can just call Get-Credential, but it needs to be parenthetical because it has to evaluate the expression first, return from the function as a secure string, and pass that in as a parameter to the credential argument. So in this case, we're going to call Get-Credential, and the domain SkyNet, and then a backslash and administrator. Okay. So for a domain admin account, and I'm going to hit enter. And I need to type in my password. And the directory services restore password, remember, it's in case you have to do an authoritative restore. So you know how in Active Directory you have more, if you have more than one domain controller, they replicate data and they're all writable servers, writable databases. So how do you prevent a conflict in that situation? How do you prevent a replication conflict? The way that Active Directory does it is it gives each piece of data a timestamp and a serial number, which it increments in every replication cycle. And so other domain controllers compare and they look at data that's replicated and they say, well, if my serial number is lower, then this is older data, and I'll write over it with this replicated data that I just received because its serial number is higher. But if my serial number is higher and that serial number is lower, I'll ignore that data and I won't write over it. However, it's just the opposite. When you're restoring from a backup, you want old data to overwrite the new data because the new data in some way has been corrupted or something. So that's what this password is for, and that's not a topic for installation videos. That's a topic for other videos entirely if we're going to focus on one thing. So sorry about that tangent. All right. So password. And yes. And now our second domain controller is joining our domain in our forest. And operation complete, status success, so that looks good. We just need to reboot. Now we have 2 domain controllers and Active Directory set up. And now that we've finished rebooting, same thing, if I hit escape, and notice now I have the option to sign in only to the domain. There is no option to sign in locally. Remember, when you promote a member server to a domain controller, you can only sign into Active Directory when it's a domain controller. Okay? There's no more local login. So SkyNet administrator. And just some information. So there's SkyNet.ai, my second DC.